Welcome back to our memory of Psalm 62. Today we are looking at verse 2, which says, "He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken." We have two phrases. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. Now we're going to make some observations about this text, but then I'm actually going to try and keep this video under about 10 minutes because there's some other things we need to look at besides just what's happening to help us memorize it. But to understand what we're actually memorizing, there are some really key things to the psalm going on in this verse that we need to talk through. And I'm excited to look at those, but just so you know, it'll be a little bit more than just a scripture memory video today. So as we're making observations, first, we'll see the repetition of this word alone. We've seen that before in verse 1. For God alone, my soul waits in silence. And now, He alone is my rock. And this is actually one of the key things we'll look at later today. This is the Hebrew word ach, and it's a main primary theme in this psalm. And I want to show you how it's working. So that's one of the things that we'll do in a moment. But continuing observations, we would say not only is this word alone repetition, we see three phrases that are all kind of parallel. He says, my rock, my salvation, my fortress. The first two wrapping up the end of phrase 1, the third introducing phrase 2. My rock, my salvation, my fortress. Even within that, there's repetition of that word salvation from yesterday, or not yesterday, but from verse 1. And then he concludes the verse with this big dramatic statement of resolve and trust. He says, I shall not be greatly shaken. And try and remember it and say it and repeat it with that same resolve and comfort from God in your heart. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail is this word alone. Then secondly, we want to look at these three descriptions, my rock, my salvation, and my fortress. So I'm just going to go right over here and show you this is the psalm written out in Hebrew. And you can see it's aligned to the right because Hebrews read from right to left. And I've highlighted already all of the usages of this word ach, which you can see that it's a primary theme. You can also see that the way the psalmist uses it is he uses it at the beginning of his phrases. So it's just this cool, beautiful literary device that the psalmist is using to promote this as a theme for the psalm. You can see even he uses it quite often. 6 out of the 13 phrases begin with it. So it's about half of the time in this psalm that the verse actually begins with this word alone. Now, just to point out this in case we do this in the future, you can see that our verses are actually going to be off by 1 because Psalm 62:1 is out in our Bibles is just it's like the preface phrase that to the chief musician, to Jeduthun, a psalm of David. But that's actually verse 1 as notated in the Hebrew Bible. So then all of the rest of our verses are off by 1 number, just so that you know what's going on there. So if this is a primary theme of this psalm, then we need to know what it means, particularly if he uses it with one definition, which unless it's clear that he's using it two different ways, we want to use it consistently. Because it's probably a theme of the psalm. I've said that far too many times already. But here are the three ways in which this word can be used. First is it can be used for emphasis, which we would translate with like surely or truly. Like kind of when Jesus is talking in the Gospels and he says, verily, verily, I say to you. He's just saying like surely or truly. I'm reassuring. I'm kind of backing up the statement with extra emphasis. And that's one way in which it's used. If you have a New King James or a King James Bible in front of you, then you'll see that that's how it's translated in verse 1, is that idea of the emphasis. Truly, my soul waits for God. So that's one way that we could take it. The second would be this idea of restriction. should translate as only or alone. Now, we've already started memorizing verse 1, and we saw it again in verse 2, this idea of alone as probably one of the main ways in which the psalmist uses it. I don't think there is a translation that uses something other than this definition of ach for at least verse 2 in the refrain, as well as verses 5 and 6 in the refrain. So it's pretty consistent that seems to be one of the themes or ways in which the psalmist uses it. The third way that this word can be used is it can contrast something. So however, or but. If you have two different ideas and you're looking to make a contrast between them, then this word can be used as the bridge between the contrast. So that one, I just wanted to mention it, but that one doesn't make too much sense in our psalm. So we're probably looking at one of the first two. So what we want to do is we want to translate them consistently, especially because verses 2 and 3, or 1 and 2, and then 5 and 6 are this repeated refrain. So what we do in one, we want to do in the other. And then there's these two other usages of the word that we're going to go look at now. So let's just transition over to English and point them out. For God alone, there it is, pretty clear, and then He alone is my rock and my salvation. Verse 5, God alone, and then He alone. So there's our refrain. We saw that pretty clearly in the Hebrew. So where are the other times that this is being used? It's actually in verse 4. They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. And then in verse 9 as well. Those of low estate are but only a breath. Now, one of the main reasons that I chose to memorize this, we're primarily memorizing out of the ESV, is because they kept a pretty consistent translation. Alone, alone, only, alone, and then here they actually translate alone or only. I changed it to alone, whether I should or shouldn't have, I don't know, but it was much more consistent. So alone, alone, only, verse 5 alone, verse 6 only, and then verse 9 but, which isn't the best translation, but they're really saying those of low estate are only a breath. It's actually breath here is our Ecclesiastes word hevel. In case you're keeping up with our Ecclesiastes study, that's just kind of an interesting side note. But we want to be consistent here. So that was one of the reasons I had a little bit more difficult time with the New King James, which takes verse 1 as truly that idea of emphasis, and then again in verse 9, surely men of low degree are a vapor, those of low estate are a breath. It was a little bit less consistent. The only translation that keeps a perfectly consistent translation of all of the words is actually the NASB, and they translate it consistently with only. So just as an interesting side note. So that's kind of what's going on with that word. I wanted to show it to you, though, in the Hebrew so that you were able to see just the vivid nature of how it's so clear that he's using it as one of his themes. So we're going to take emphasis, or not emphasis, but restriction, God alone, He alone, pretty consistently throughout the psalm. So then the second thing we want to talk about is the descriptions. My rock, my salvation, my fortress. And one thing you've got to do when you're reading a psalm is use your imagination. These are poems. This is poetry. These are songs. This is supposed to trigger your imagination to paint these pictures in your mind. So when he says, my rock, my salvation, my fortress, you really should begin to imagine a rock. Now, what does he say? What does he meaning when he says rock? Well, he's talking about strength, right? It's a metaphor for strength, certainty, immovability. It's not going anywhere. It's unmoving. So that's kind of this idea of rock, right? It's just this strong God. And then he says, my salvation. Interesting. We just memorized in verse 1 that God is the source of salvation, right? Our salvation comes from Him. But here, he talks about it as a description of His character. This is who God is. He is not only the source of salvation, He is the salvation. So this is kind of this beautiful contrast in the way that the psalmist is using or describing the salvation that comes from God. So he's my rock, my salvation, it's his character, it's who he is, and then finally my fortress. And so we actually want to imagine this big fortress on this rock, that God is, he is our protection. This is a safe place. God is a safe place. He's our refuge. He's where we want to go in times of trouble, which we're about to memorize in the next few verses, is the trouble that David's in the middle of. But where are we in this whole picture? Well, we're right here. This is us. And God is this. This is a beautiful description of God as the rock, the salvation, the fortress. And it's only because this is where we're at. It's only because of his character that we can say, my soul waits in silence. It's only because of his character that we can say, I will not be greatly shaken, because it's the character of God that establishes our strength, our refuge. That's who he is. So those are our thoughts for today. Spend some time now. Say verse 22, or say verse 2 25 times, and then we're reviewing verse 1, saying it 20 times. And I hope that you will be encouraged as you reflect on these beautiful truths of God as our refuge and our strength.